Good evening. Welcome to MTC. You remember what those letters stand for? Sometimes we stray a little bit, but me, thee, and charity. Charity, I'm kind of saving up, and one of these days I'll tell you what my plans are for charity. But anyway, tonight I want to talk to you about something, and I'm going to start by showing it to you. See that? Now I've already lied because that looks like a huckleberry, but it's really not. It's a blueberry. And I want to talk to you about huckleberries tonight, not blueberries. Blueberries you can go to the grocery store and buy year-round. And they're good, but huckleberries are so much better. And you can't buy them ever. Unless you can find somebody that's really gullible. Let me tell you why. Because huckleberries are found only in rare places. They're not prevalent. You can't grow them in the garden. You can't find them along the fence lines or in the foothills or wherever. When you go find a huckleberry, you go up into some of the highest mountains around, at least we did. They weren't like above the tree line mountains, but they were up in the pines, and sometimes quite a ways up in the pines. You just have to drive quite a few miles to get to them if you could find them. And luckily we knew a few people that had picked them previously and found them here and there. Sometimes if you ask somebody where they are, because they're so precious and they don't want to share it with you, they'll say, "I'll tell you where they are. We found them up No Tell'em Creek." Now stop and think about that for just a minute. You'll understand what I'm talking about. No Tell'em Creek is where you find them, because people, when they found them, kind of wanted to keep them for their own little private patch and didn't want to tell people about them. So they were always found up No Tell'em Creek. Well, I first heard about huckleberries from my mother, and she came from a large family of 16 brothers and sisters, and not all of them lived, but there was a large family. And her family, as part of, I guess it was part of their tradition, but it was a kind of a survival tradition too, because at certain times of the year, their family, or a good portion of their family, would go up into the hills where the huckleberries were prevalent. You'll have to forgive me when I scratch my nose a little bit. Sometimes it just itches. Anyway, they'd go, a good portion of her family would go up into the hills and be delivered up there, and they'd actually camp in and around the huckleberry patch. And some of them would have to go back and do chores and milk cows and different things at their farm. But some of them would stay there and sleep and pick huckleberries all day long for several days when the huckleberry picking was good. Now, when I say good, you have to know how huckleberries grow. They're not like peas on a pod, and they're not like choke cherries where you can just get your hand and strip a whole bunch off at once. They're not like elderberries where you can just clip a whole big bunch of them off and drop them in the bucket, fills a third of the bucket up with one bunch. They're not anywhere near like that. They grow in little places, or they grow just singly. So seldom, if ever, can you just reach down and pick more than one huckleberry at a time. And keep in mind, the reason I brought a blueberry is because a huckleberry is about the same size. Most of the blueberries that I've seen are a little bit bigger than huckleberries. But I just wanted to give you an idea because the coloration on them is not all that much different. Huckleberries have a more of a purple tone to them. And they get a little darker as they get more ripe. And as they get more ripe, they get more taste. But back to my mother's family. So she would tell about times when they'd go up into the huckleberry field and they would pick for days with quite a few people, and they would fill milk cans full of huckleberries. Now, if you've ever been to a huckleberry patch and you realize what went into filling even a gallon jug, you would come to appreciate the fact that that was a lot of huckleberry picking, and there was a lot of sacrifice that went out to fill a milk can full, and they filled multiple milk cans full. She would tell us stories about them. Well, I'm sure back in her day, I'm not sure if they had freezers or not. I doubt it. Maybe, but anyway, certainly during her early life, they wouldn't have had freezers, so they would have bottled probably the huckleberries and used them later that winter out of the bottles. Now, you're not going to appreciate any of this without tasting a huckleberry. And I wish there was some way I could reach right through the screen and hand you a huckleberry instead of a blueberry and let you actually taste it. Because once you tasted a huckleberry, you've tasted something that you'll never taste again. There's nothing quite like it. It is so flavorful. It's hard to even describe the taste of it because there's no words and there's nothing similar. Now you'll see advertisements for huckleberry plants that you can plant, in your backyard and all of that. And you'll go to restaurants and they'll have like huckleberry pie. Don't you believe it? They're not huckleberries. They're some sort of a offshoot. Maybe they call them huckleberries, but they're not real huckleberries. Real huckleberries are grown up in the mountains. And I've tasted both, the kind you can buy and the kind you can grow and the kind that they serve in so-called huckleberry pies and so forth in stores or restaurants. But they're not huckleberries. They don't even come close. These huckleberries that my mother and her family would pick, there would usually be they grow in, I wouldn't say patches, but there's certain conditions that have to exist. And those conditions are that they'll grow under pine trees. And they grow on bushes that are maybe 2.5 or 3 feet tall, something like that. And you can come into areas where there's just a little inkling of a huckleberry. You might see one here and there, but keep walking and keep looking because it's so hard to pick and make a day's picking seem like much if you don't have what we call in the huckleberry world good picking. Now, good picking means a little bigger huckleberries and more of them. So you keep looking, you hike up into the hills, and family is necessary. I shouldn't say that. It's not necessary. You can go alone. But honest to Pete, there's nothing that beats sitting down under a pine tree in a huckleberry patch with a good friend or some family members and just sitting in the bushes like a big bear picking huckleberries. And anyway, my mother took us to some of those places where she knew where they were. And one of the things that I learned early on was that, especially as a little kid, my mother knew all about huckleberry picking, and she would have us little kids, and I've done it with my own grandchildren and so forth, but she'd have these little kids, us little kids, she'd put a string around our waist, and you had to be careful not to spill them, because if you spilled them, it was almost like spilling gold dust. It was just so valuable. But she would have us, if they gave us a gallon and said, go pick huckleberries in it, we would get discouraged so fast, because we'd pick and pick and pick for what seemed like the longest time, and then we'd look in our container, and you could still see the bottom of the container. There was hardly anything there to show for it. So we'd get discouraged really quick and think, well, we're not helping at all, we'll just stop. And my mother knew that, bless her heart. She knew how to get a little out of you. So here's what she did. She'd have you take an orange juice container or a grape juice can, and she'd put some strings on it, and she'd attach it to you some way sometimes it would be with like a dish towel that she'd wrap around your waist, and then put the cup there and tie the little orange juice can to your waist, or to a belt or something. It depended on what she had and what you needed. But her strategy was, if you picked in the juice can, you could pick in there, a little kid could, and pretty soon you could look in that container, and there you couldn't see the bottom. You could just see huckleberries. And so you'd get pretty encouraged, and you'd tell your mom, come look, I've already covered the bottom of my container. And she'd look, and she'd pat you on the back and make you feel so good about yourself, and you'd just go to picking, and pretty soon the container would be half full. And you'd just tell her, my container is half full. And she'd say, oh, you are such a good boy, way to go. You are a hard worker. You don't give up when things are tough. And anyway, she would say that. So you just keep picking. Well, pretty soon, the little juice can was full. There wasn't all that many huckleberries in there, but the juice can was full, and it was pretty rewarding, and you didn't lose hope. And my mother understood that concept, that you needed to have hope. That might be one of the takeaways from this whole thing, is if you can think about it, a person needs hope. I don't care what phase of life you're in, or what you're picking, or what you're dealing with. But if you take little bite-sized pieces, little containers, and work on what you can have hope. All right, there's a quick little lesson from the Huckleberry Patch. Now, we'd empty those containers, and then we'd fill another one up, and she could pretty much keep us picking all day long if she had a juice can. But if she ever tied a gallon container onto you, you'd just look at it and roll your eyes and quit right there. And maybe that's the way we are. We need to take things in smaller steps. Well, so you sit down in those huckleberry bushes, and the huckleberries usually kind of grew on the underside of the leaves that were there, and the plants, like I said, are maybe 3 feet tall, and just like a big bear. And we had a little tasting going on too, just like the bears do. We didn't eat them all. In fact, the parents and those that were responsible for getting some real berries back to the house were kind of after us. And they kind of set the rules down. They'd say, okay, you can have a few berries, but after you've had a few, then that's all. And then wait till we tell you can have some more, and then you can have a few more, and then that's all. Because otherwise, it would be like, I don't know what to compare it to. It would be like a cook cooking an apple pie and eating the apples as she cooked it. So when the pie was ready, there was no apples there. Well, we were kind of like that with huckleberries. I have lots of memories that take me to the huckleberry patch. Memories that stretch back over my childhood, clear through my teenage years into my early married life, and have followed me clear through to this day when I go out with some of my older siblings or brothers or whatever. We work our way up into the huckleberry patch, even with our old bad knees, and we're out of shape, puffing and panting the time we get there because it was usually up higher in the mountains. But then when you sit down in the huckleberry patch, and there's always shade. It's never hot. And you sit down and eat a few huckleberries and start visiting about things. It's just amazing what you can visit about when you're in the huckleberry patch. Stuff that you wouldn't visit about anywhere else. You feel perfectly fine talking about it in the huckleberry patch. It's a little bit like what they say about Las Vegas. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Well, that's kind of the way it is with huckleberries. What happens in the huckleberry patch stays in the huckleberry patch. You can talk about just about anything. And it was fun. The conversation, you learned to pick while you were talking. As you got older anyway, they had to tell us kids to be quiet and start picking. But as you get older, you could keep yourself picking while you were talking. And we'd sit in the patch and kind of slide ourselves down the hill to the next bush, sitting right on the bushes sometimes, because it's hard to get around them. So you'd try, but you'd slide down through the bushes to the next huckleberry patch where there's some better berries still, and you keep picking and picking and picking. And pretty soon, if you stand up and somebody look at you, they'd say, "Oh man, you got into the huckleberries today." And you know how you could find out? By looking at their butt end, because their butt end was purple with huckleberry berry juice. And I'm here to tell you, you can ask the wives that had to wash the clothes wash the clothes after a huckleberry picking trip. Huckleberry stains are like no other stains you've ever had before. They'll like ruin a pair of pants permanently. So quite often, if we knew we were going huckleberry picking and we knew there was no way you could avoid the problem and still be a good picker, we'd just wear an old pair of Levi's that maybe we wouldn't wear anywhere else, but we'd wear to the huckleberry patch, because when we got done, they were pretty much finished as far as taken out in public anywhere. So, but if you had real good picking and you just kind of kept at it and were a little disciplined, you could pick like a gallon of huckleberries. I'm talking adults here, little kids wouldn't do as well. But you could pick a gallon of huckleberries in about a half a day. So that meant that in a full day's picking, 8 hours, you might pick 2 gallons. If you're a real good picker, you could get a little more than that. But on average, good pickers would get a couple of gallons in a day. Now, a couple of gallons doesn't seem like much for 8 hours work. But you could take a few of those huckleberries, and we did this. My mother did it all the time. My wife's done it. You could take a few of those huckleberries and put them in some like raspberry jam. Oh, that's another thing. The huckleberries came on about the same time of the year that the raspberries came on, usually about the first week in August or thereabouts. And anyway, you could put it, so it was really convenient because you'd be making raspberry jam. All you'd have to do is sprinkle just a few huckleberries into that raspberry jam. And this would give you an idea of what they tasted like. It would make the whole pint of raspberries taste like huckleberries. and you wouldn't need very many of them to do it. So it made it really worthwhile. And we found out that was one of the better ways to use them, is mix them with huckleberries, and you got that raspberry taste even in the huckleberries, and huckleberries have a little flavor to them too, so gives you an idea about the raspberry potency, or the huckleberry potency, I should say. And the other thing you could do is you could make a pie out of them, and I've eaten some straight huckleberry pies. But one of the best ways to eat huckleberries in pie form is to have like a cream pie of some sort, and then mix huckleberries in the cream. So it's like a huckleberry cream pie. Now, you've heard of coconut cream and banana cream and all that. It doesn't even come close to the taste of a huckleberry cream pie. They're to die for. You'll never get them unless you pick the huckleberries and make it yourself. And it's hard to tell somebody what they taste like, because anyway. So you're sitting there thinking, gosh, this old man really into his huckleberries, isn't he? Yeah, I kind of am, but a lot of it has to do with the memories that I made in the huckleberry patch. It was just a relaxing, peaceful, joyous communication with others. Flip a few in your mouth when you needed a little pick me up, and just the hours went by actually quite fast, especially as you grew older. When you were younger and more focused on how fast you were picking, and you weren't keeping up with the adults, and they were, especially if they were after you, well, it wasn't as much fun. But as you become an adult, you just learn to pick pretty fast and talk the same. And it was just joyful. It's hard to put a price on something like that. You know, we pay a lot of money for big vacations, go and do and all this. It doesn't even come close to sitting in a huckleberry patch with some friends and family. And I guess if you sat there by yourself, you're a reflective kind of person, and I've done that too. Sometimes I'll go with somebody, but we'll get on different parts of the hill and get separated for a little bit. You just start thinking about things while you're picking, and the hours seem to click by. And the reason they click by is because you're enjoying them. Anyway, I can remember when I was a little kid, I went huckleberry picking, and I think this was back in the orange juice can days. And I remember going off, and I still remember finding a place where there's just really good huckleberries, and somehow I got separated from my family members, and I thought I could find my way back to them real quick. But as it turns out, when it was time to go back and find out where they were, I didn't think I was that far away. I couldn't find them. And I remember kind of panicking. It was the first time I'd really been lost in the hills. But there for a little while I was lost, and I knew the feeling of being lost in the mountains from that experience. And when I got lost, I thought I was almost panicking, and I thought, oh no, I can't find them. What am I going to do? And again, I was just a little kid, but I started thinking, oh, I've just got to go find them. And I started getting further and further away from where they actually were, thinking that I was going in the right direction, and I was going in the wrong direction. And finally, one of them yelled out really loud, and I could hear them. And I yelled back, and they were able to locate where I was, because they were starting to wonder too. And anyway, they found me, and I found them. And it was a relief. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have somebody lost permanently. And when you wanted to be near them and you loved them, there was no hope for that. And anyway, I've always figured that hope must be kept alive. And the other thing I learned from that experience is because they told me, they said, when you're lost like that, stay put and just yell loud and be patient, and people will know enough to find you. They just start making wider and wider circles until they find you. But if you head off down the mountains, you might never get found. So I'll pass that on too, in case you're ever lost. But huckleberries were part of my growing up experience, and I'm hoping even this fall with a bad knee and everything else I got going that I can maybe get with a brother and go up there. My wife has long since been out of the huckleberry picking program because of her health and back problems and different things. And I've got knee problems, but I'll take a painkiller or something if I have to and make it to the huckleberry patch. I just want to do it another time or two, maybe more. When you're too old to pick huckleberries, you're just too old. I hope that I never get quite that old, but I know it's coming. Well, the one thing that I think, as I thought about what I might talk about tonight, and huckleberries came across my mind, the one thing that I thought about was, because I usually try to make a point with some of these uploads that I make to the YouTube channel, and that is, there's lessons that can be learned in nature, like we've talked about, just about anywhere you go. And one of the things that you learn is good things sometimes come in really small packages. And in this case, they're packaged one at a time under a leaf, in a huckleberry leaf at the top of a mountain. And they require work. But some of the best things in life require work. Can you think of some of those things that you worked the hardest for, where you really rolled up your sleeves and gave it everything you had? And I bet you if you were honest with yourself, you'd say, yeah, I can think of some of those things, and they were actually quite rewarding. And that's the way it is with huckleberries. The other thing to take away from this is, just because you can't buy it at a store, like you can blueberries here, I'll show it to you again, just like you can blueberries. Just because you can't get it at the store doesn't mean you can't have it or something better isn't out there. And in this case, you would never find blueberries or huckleberries at the store. So if you want one, you got to go get it. And isn't that the way life is? You want something that's really good, it's not going to fall in your lap when you're walking through a grocery store. You got to roll up your sleeves and figure it out and scout it out and make time for it. And it works. So there's another takeaway from the Huckleberry Patch. Another takeaway is people. People are most enjoyed one-on-one or one-on-two at the most. Thoreau used to say, speaking of Thoreau, he'd build a little cabin and he had 3 chairs in it. And he said he had one for company, or 1 for solitude, 2 for company, and 3 for a crowd, I think is the way he said it. So if you get over 3, you're crowded. And that's kind of the way it was in the Huckleberry Patch. If you had more than 3, it took away from the experience. And then Thoreau would always say, and if you wanted more than that, you went outside. And of course, picking huckleberries, that's where you are anyway, is outside. But small, intimate conversations, whether they're in a huckleberry patch or somewhere else, you can just accomplish so much more with them. You get to know the person. They confide in you. They seem to trust you more in that setting than if it's just a hurried conversation in somewhere else. And sometimes you might not even have anything to talk about, and that's okay. I've noticed that sometimes when I'm at a restaurant or something, there'll be an older couple come in, and they'll sit down together, and they'll eat their dinners and never say a word to each other. And at first I thought, well, that's kind of weird. They must not like each other. But then as you watch them, and you see the lines even on their face that kind of communicate something to you, you think the reason they don't have to talk to each other is because they don't need to. They've experienced enough life together that just the sound of silence doesn't bother them at all. And yet a lot of us think that in those settings that if we're not talking, we're being antisocial or being rude or something. No, if you really know somebody and they know you and you've lived a life together like those older people have, you find out that it's okay. Just enjoy your dinner. There's other times to talk. And so I've learned to respect them for their relationship when they don't have to talk. Are there some other takeaways from the Huckleberry Patch? Yes. Patience is one of the most endearing qualities that a person can have. It takes a lot of faith to have patience. I don't have nearly enough of it. It's one of the things I've had to work at in my old age. I have a tendency to, especially if I'm tired or there's problems or I'm anxious about something, I have a tendency to use a different tone of voice that's not very nice, and shame on me. I can have patience. And if there's anything, I try to find something to repent from every day when I say my prayers, and I figure if I take it to the Lord and I repent, then he'll hear me, and if I ask for his help, he'll help me. But guess what? This patience thing, I take to the Lord and I tell him I haven't been patient today. I know it. I'm sorry. I did this and I did that and I said this and I used this tone of voice and acted this way, and I'm sorry. I wish I hadn't done it. Please forgive me. And then that's all good. But where it gets tough is when you go the next day and you have the very same problems. And that's kind of the way it is with me. So you have to be forgiving. And the other thing you learn is this patience thing is you want people to be patient with you. But sometimes we don't think that it works both ways. We want people to be patient with us. Like sometimes I'll be stopped at a stoplight, and if I don't slam on the gas the minute the light changes, I'll hear somebody honk their horn because they don't have any patience for me. Well, I've often wondered when I pull up behind somebody else and they don't go when the light turns green, what they do if I slammed on my horn. I've never tried it. It just doesn't matter that much to me, but it matters to a lot of people. And so patience is a virtue, and it's a required virtue for us to progress like we need to. And you can learn that in a huckleberry patch in the incremental steps by first starting in an orange can and then moving to a little bigger, maybe a peach can. Pretty soon you're picking in a gallon can like the adults, and you've learned how to exercise patience and keep plugging away, keep pulling in the harness, so to speak. I've talked to you about Duke and Dolly. You can go look at that video if you want to know about pulling in the harness and how important that is. So anyway, patience is another thing you can learn from the Huckleberry Patch. And that doesn't include things like learning wisdom about not getting lost and taking one little berry, huckleberry, putting it in your mouth, especially if it's the last one you're going to taste that day, and just savoring every minute of it. So there's a lesson there too. If you got something good, savor it. Savor it. Don't gulp it. Savor it. Well, lessons from the Huckleberry Patch. Maybe you can reminisce. And I hope to see you someday in the Huckleberry Patch. Wouldn't that be great? And if you ever want to know where they are, just ask me. I'll tell you. They're up No Tell 'em Creek. All right. Love you all. Happy picking. Good night.